What is the GCSB?
Thanks again, Michael.
Guratato, I've got a streaming cold tonight, so if you can't hear me at the back, please tell me. I'm very glad to go after Michael because he's focused us in on what the point of this discussion is. It's not a technical discussion, it's about the corrosive effect of surveillance in a society. It's about the way that privacy can seem like a kind of expendable part of decision making, but it's actually about people's sense of self. It's about how we feel when we walk down the road. Do we feel we've been watched by a security camera when we walk through the mall? Do we think we're being watched by a security camera when we walk into a shop? I really hate it when political people wonder whether they're being listened to when they talk on the telephone. That should just never happen. I hate the way that there's fear in the public service about surveillance as well. And unfortunately, there's great fear in some immigrant communities, partly from their past experiences and partly because of the stupidity of the intelligence services here. And so what we're here to talk about today is two things, and I want to distinguish between them. One is the actual surveillance that goes on and how to control it and the problem of expanding at the moment. But the other is the fear of it and the problems that that causes in our society. And so what I'm going to be covering tonight, I'm going to be a much more technical kind of talk. I'm going to talk about exactly what the GCSB does, how it fits into the range of intelligence agencies we've got, what the problem with it is, and then how the issue of surveillance of New Zealanders comes up within that. But as part of that, I want to do something else, which is talk about what it doesn't do. In other words, we've got to do two things here. We've got to look at what's going on and the expansion of powers which the GCSB is getting at the moment, the unjustified expansion. But also, I want to touch a bit on what it's not doing, because all of us have got a responsibility not to encourage that fear, which is the worst impact of surveillance in a society. And so a realistic view, a concerned view, but a realistic view is what I'm arguing for here. The main spy agencies, or the main agencies which spy in New Zealand, are the police, through police intelligence, the SIS, the Security Intelligence Service, and the GCSB. They're the main ones. So I want to talk about what their different roles are so we can put the GCSB in a context. GCSB is the one that spies the least on New Zealanders. And so if we want to understand what it does, we need to look at the bigger picture and why it's a problem that it's there at all. Police spying, well, I'll start with the SIS actually. The SIS was the organisation in New Zealand that was for years, not only spied on the Russian embassy and the Chinese embassy and any communist delegations coming to New Zealand, they also spied on socialist groups in New Zealand, left-wing groups. It was the main organisation that spied on political people down through the decades. About 10 or 15 years ago, the police took over from that. And the main surveillance of political people for the last decade or so has been by a relatively small, but still noxious, group within the police, who've got the specialised job of spying on political people. Nowadays, the SIS focuses half on spying on other countries. That's enemy countries like China and Iran, their allies, enemies in New Zealand, the local embassies, the connections with those countries. And unfortunately, it also follows its allies' preoccupation in targeting particularly refugee groups, immigrant groups, and I may as well say it, Muslim kind of groups in New Zealand. And so that's where the SIS has been located in the recent past and the further ago past. If you're in the SIS today, its principal preoccupation is no longer terrorism, it's China, which is just, again, a reflection of it being a piggybacking on its allies' concern. The police mainly do crime, but unfortunately they've taken over the job. It's no coincidence that they did the Operation 8, Uruwera raids and things. They've taken over the job of spying on political groups. And so when they're spying on New Zealanders, it's partly for their criminal activities, but sometimes it's not for criminal activities, it's just for people who are involved in politics. So the SIS and the police are the main places where spying on New Zealanders by the state occurs. Then there's the GCSB. The GCSB is not an internal spying agency, even though it's begun to do so. It's a foreign intelligence agency. It mainly spies on other countries, and its operations only make sense as part of an international system. It's the most foreign-oriented organisation on New Zealand soil. as part of New Zealand's government system. GCSB, as you probably know, its main place where it spies from is that base called Waihopai down in Marlborough, which has two great big white balls, and under the big white balls are these satellite dishes, like a telecommunications satellite dish. It's spying on a great big satellite which sits above Kiribati, wobbles around above the equator, which has communications between different sides of the Pacific and the South Pacific countries. It's doing that job on behalf of the alliance, the American alliance. It downloads everything that's going through those satellites into the big computers down in Blenheim and searches them for targets, most of which have come, as I say, from their allies, from the United States, from Canada, from Britain and Australia. And also partly New Zealanders spy through that as well. It's also, I think, but I'm not certain, spying on an Asian satellite at the moment. I'm not sure particularly which one. And there are 3 or 4 other satellite dishes in the grounds there which are spying on different satellites above the Pacific. And so what its job is, it spies on satellite communications, which are not most of the communications in the world. Now, it's a very important point to realise in this. When the GCSB is asked to spy on Dotcom, for example, most of Dotcom's communications aren't going to go via Pacific satellites. They're going to whiz along on an undersea cable and a fibre optic cable under the oceans and bob up on the continents far from here. So they won't be caught by Waihopai anyway. And what happens when they spy on Dotcom or other people, what the GCSB is doing when it does that, is it's using its place as being part of an international spying network. And so if they want to spy on Dotcom, or they want to spy on someone in this table, or the Urewera people, or something like this, what they would be doing is they would be taking their email address or some other words which identify that person in the massive billions of communications which flow around the world's systems and feeding that into the overseas, largely American intelligence systems. And so what it means when the GCSB takes over something, you go, the police tail people, they sometimes plant people in meetings, they might bug a phone, but they certainly get call data which is checking up on who's calling whom and what people's texts are. The SIS tails people as well, and they sometimes monitor phones and things with the work they do. The GCSB is a step up. It's a completely different kind of technology. It means that when the GCSB comes in, they are using their international networks because those few satellites they monitor are such a small part of the world's communications. To monitor someone, they use their linkages into that worldwide system so that they can spy, they can use the American alliance basically, to spy on those people's worldwide communications, however they happen to be routed through the internet around the world. And so it's kind of like bringing the Cold War to surveillance of the person in New Zealand. It's Cold War kind of intelligence capabilities to spying on someone in New Zealand. It's a big step up from tailing someone or sitting outside their house or bugging their phone in New Zealand. So that's what different agencies do. How did the GCSB get into this? For a long time, New Zealanders were told repeatedly, and in fact GCSB staff were told, you are not going to spy on any New Zealanders. And they basically didn't do it, because I've talked to the staff. But something seems to have happened since September 11, 2001, where, first of all, the big countries like the United States started to say, the enemy is within, we have to use our great big capabilities on our own citizens, and it seems like New Zealand has followed them down that track. Because it didn't used to happen, and now it does. They used a loophole in their existing legislation which said that they could help on the detection of serious crime. But another part of the act said they would never spy on New Zealanders, so people like me never realised that they would be turning it against New Zealand, because I thought it was a triad or something. But it wasn't. So for the last 10 years or so, the GCSB has been sneaking into a role also spying on New Zealanders. But to put it back in the picture of the police, the SIS and the GCSB, the spying that the GCSB does is on behalf of the two agencies that spy within New Zealand. It does it for the police or the SIS. That's what its role is. There is not a unit within the GCSB which is a spying on New Zealand unit. They've got their spying on Persian communications and their Arabic communications since the War on Terror. They still spy on the South Pacific states. But the GCSB itself doesn't spy on New Zealanders. What it does is it lends its capabilities to those other agencies to spy on New Zealanders. What else does the GCSB do? just be aware of the noxiousness of it. Most of the bad stuff it does is outside New Zealand. We spy on the microstates in the South Pacific and give the information to big powers outside. In the last 10 years, GCSB and military people have been spying inside Afghanistan and helping the targeting of bombs and special forces and drones in that country working in the middle of the American intelligence services. I would personally regard that as the most destructive thing that the GCSB and GCSB trained military people have done in the last decade. But besides that, they have this role that we're talking about tonight, this creeping role of turning those Cold War and then War on Terror type global systems to use on New Zealanders when they're requested by the police or the SIS. As I said, under the current law, it was very clear. You'll read every statement that comes out of the government at the moment says the law was blurry, it was ambiguous, we had to tidy up the law. The law said you will not spy on New Zealanders, full stop. It was absolutely clear. There was no ambiguity at all in the law. It also said that they could lend their services to unspecified government agencies to detect serious crime. It's sort of 2B15. It's really at the end of what their specifications of what they do. But that was in the context of never spying on New Zealanders. The law was absolutely clear. It seems that they were doing that, they were lending those services maybe a dozen times a year, if the figures are true. So the SIS mainly, and occasionally the police, were coming to them and asking to use their resources, those mainly overseas resources, or waihopai, to spy on someone's emails or other communications a few times a year. The new GCSB Act, the new GCSB bill, which is why we're here today, changes this in a big way. You just heard from Michael that Judith Collins said there'd be no extension of powers. And various people have been criticising the government for that this bill is a way of legalising the unlawful spying that was already happening. Unfortunately, it's worse than that. That if you go and read that bill carefully, it's gone from legalising the spying they were already doing to expanding it and making it much easier to use these resources. What the bill now says is that under the legislation, a month after it's passed, the police and the SIS, and weirdly, the New Zealand Defence Force, will be able to go to GCSB and as long as they're within their lawful functions, which is a very broad specification for those three organisations, they can use the GCSB for any cases that they want to. So what will this mean, and what will it not mean? Right? Most people don't know the GCSB, so it sounds shadowy and scary. And it is huge and powerful and part of an international network that if you're in Afghanistan or somewhere does a lot of harm. But let's be clear, it does not mean that the GCSB will now be automatically scanning all New Zealanders' emails and we will all be surveilled. That is not what it means. I've read the bill carefully, I know the situation. That will not be what's happening. There will not be GCSB vans parking outside people's houses. The GCSB is not some new political police force. But what it is an agency which since the Second World War and down through the Cold War and through the War on Terror, built up these very powerful surveillance capabilities to use against the Russians and the Chinese and the little Pacific states, because we thought we were being helpful spying on them for the Americans and British and Australians. And for spying on Japan, they still do that all the time. But those massive global capabilities under this bill will now be allowed to be applied to a New Zealander if either the SIS or the GCSB, or as I said weirdly, the New Zealand Defence Force want to do that. This is a huge rise in capability for the SIS and the police to have availability of that whenever they want to. And we have every reason to fear, I believe, that when this law is passed, it will go from being a dozen cases a year or something to more and more, because if you've got a capability you can use, you will, unfortunately, tend to use it. So finally, I have one suggestion. If you're making submissions on the bill, even in the face of probably a not very sympathetic government, and you should make submissions on this bill, I think that you should be asking for an amendment which says that the GCSB will have to report annually how many times that it uses its resources to help the SIS and the police and the Defence Force. The SIS and police already have to report that in their own annual reports, so there's no good reason why when the GCSB does it for them, we shouldn't know the numbers as well. And my point, of course, is that if we achieve that, and we do see the annual numbers, the sad fact is that I'm sure we're going to see them rising fast.